Good day from Washington, and a warm welcome from the Africa Center to all our colleagues, alumni, and partners that have registered from across the African continent and beyond for this webinar on artificial intelligence challenges and opportunities. This is the first of a part webinar series. We hope to provide a pretty comprehensive introduction to all of those interested in learning more about the security implications of artificial intelligence for Africa. My name is Dr. Nate Allen, and I am Associate Professor of Security Studies here at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, and ACSS's faculty lead on cyber and emerging technology issues. And before we continue with today's program, I'd like to turn things over to our acting director, Daniel Hampton, to say a few words of welcome and to talk about the Africa Center. Dan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nate, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and for your interest in this program. As Dr. Allen mentioned, my name is Daniel Hampton, and I'm the acting director for the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. Many of you may know the Africa Center, but for those who are new and for those who've been with us, just a little refresher about who we are. The Africa Center was established by the U.S. Congress in 1999, 26 years ago. We recently celebrated our 25th anniversary last year. And for the study of security issues relating to Africa and serving as a forum for research, communication, and exchange of ideas. And to achieve this mandate from our Congress, we developed the following mission statement: to advance African security by expanding understanding, providing a trusted platform for dialogue, and building enduring partnerships and catalyzing strategic solutions. We're organized around 3 pillars within the organization to execute that mission. The first is our academic affairs section, which organizes seminars, workshops, and webinars and events similar to what we're doing now in this series on AI. Second is our research and strategic communications section. If you're not familiar with our website, which is africacenter.org, I would strongly encourage you to check it out and use it as a resource. We have all our publications are in English, French, Portuguese, some are in Arabic and other languages. They're all available free to download in PDF format. We also have a number of spotlights or blog pieces, infographics that we post. I think it's a valuable resource, so if you're not familiar with it, africacenter.org, please save it in your bookmarks and use it frequently. And then lastly, we have our community and alumni affairs section. And really, they are focused on building and sustaining those enduring partnerships that I spoke of in our mission statement. And I'm pleased that we have so many alumni that are joining us today. Thank you very much. I frequently say, and I truly believe this, that our alumni network is the true strength of the Africa Center. And our relationship with you is what keeps us relevant and focused on the security issues that are most important to Africans, which is really what it's all about for us to be relevant, is to make sure that we're focused on what's important to the African security sector practitioners. I'm so pleased that we're able to offer this webinar today, actually the first in a series. There's a much discussion and increasing recognition of the role and relevance of AI within the security domain. So I think this is going to be a productive webinar today, a productive series as we move forward. So thank you again for sharing your time with us, and I'm looking forward to the exchange. Dr. Allen, back over to you.
No technology has captured the popular imagination quite like artificial intelligence. That's because there's perhaps no greater achievement than humanity replicating its own genius, and perhaps we don't have any greater latent fear than being surpassed by our creations. I think, as we'll find, the reality is actually a little more complex, and that's what we're going to demystify for you over the course of this webinar series. As one analyst had put it, and as we heard in a webinar we did on this topic several years ago, AI is arguably neither artificial nor intelligent and has been powering various aspects of the digital economy for quite a while. AI-driven algorithms, for example, power the search results you see. They determine what route you take as you drive and what content you see on social media. And while generative AI models like X's Grok or OpenAI's ChatGPT have made waves in recent years specifically for their natural language processing capabilities, AI has been capable of superhuman feats for quite some time. It was, for example, nearly 30 years ago in 1997 that the supercomputer Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov, the world's greatest chess player, in a game of chess. So, over the course of the coming 6 weeks, we're going to delve deep into the security implications of artificial intelligence for Africa and talk about how to develop and make strategy regarding artificial intelligence. Um, we're going to be ambitious in scope, and we're going to discuss everything from how AI is being used by non-state actors in the information domain to considerations that may go into acquiring AI-powered intelligence and surveillance systems. First, however, we all need a baseline understanding of what exactly AI is, how it is being used, and how it is likely to shape the African continent both now and in the future. And to kick us off on this topic, on the opportunities and challenges of AI, we are blessed with the presence of two very distinguished and experienced experts. And I can guarantee that they're going to help us better understand AI's opportunities and challenges better than you would by having a conversation with ChatGPT. So they are, in order in which I will be asking them questions. We have first Dr. Chinasa T. Okolo, who is a fellow at Brookings Institution and a recent computer science PhD graduate from Cornell University. Dr. Okolo has been recognized as one of the world's most influential people in AI by Time and honored in the Forbes 30 Under 30 in AI. Among many other things, she serves as a drafting member of the Nigerian National AI Strategy and a consulting expert on the African Union Continental AI Strategy. If you check our program page for the entire webinar series, you can see in greater detail the bios of all the speakers that we have assembled for this. So I'm going to put a link here in the chat. We also have with us Dr. Rachel Adams, who is the CEO and founder of the Global Center on AI Governance and a senior research analyst at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge. She advises policymakers around the world on AI governance and strategy and was one of the lead drafters of the African Union's Commission on Continental AI Strategy. In November 2024, Rachel's third book, The New Empire of AI, which actually just arrived here yesterday, so I've started to dig into it, was published by the Polity Press. So let's get right into this. We're really happy to have both of you with us, and we're going to start with you, Dr. Okolo. I think before we get into the conversation on AI's implications, we really need to have a baseline understanding of what AI is and where it's going. And I know that the definition has at times been subject to controversy. So how would you define artificial intelligence? What do you see as AI's current capabilities, and how do you see them evolving in the future?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Dr. Allen. Again, we've all, seem to be inundated with AI and particularly with many different definitions of these respective technologies. And so for me, I consider it to be the field of computer science that aims to make, machines, whether they be computers, phones, or automated systems, think and behave. And I use that in quotes because I don't like to anthropomorphize these respective systems. But they aim to think and behave like humans, to perform tasks like learning, problem solving, identification, planning, reasoning, and decision making. And right now, I would say like we're basically in like three categories within of AI. Predictive, which many people have actually been exposed to, for the past, let's say, like a couple decades or so now. Agentic, which is, beginning to emerge with, tools like Cursor and others, from OpenAI that aim to operate on your respective behalf. And then also generative AI, which, basically sparked off this new AI boom that we're seeing. And, again, these are tools, from companies like OpenAI, ChatGPT, obviously, and others, from Anthropic and and Google and Microsoft, which is basically OpenAI at this point. But also, I do want to note that, AI, leverages techniques like machine learning to help these respective algorithms within AI systems learn and adapt without following explicit instructions. And so, again, it's leveraging algorithms and also stats models to analyze and also draw inferences from patterns in data, which allow it to either predict or generate, different types of content, excuse me.
Thank you very, very much. I think the key takeaway from that is that AI it's a technology. It's like a tool. It's not necessarily a human. It's meant to kind of mimic human reasoning. It's not necessarily a human being. And as with any technology, AI carries with it both benefits and risks. We maybe have heard a lot about both of those over the past couple of years, but I'd like to begin with a discussion of AI's potential. Due to the growth and advancement of AI, as you mentioned, especially predictive AI, is a lot more commonplace than people think. As AI continues to advance, we're probably going to see its use more in its agentic form. Maybe someday, as people keep on predicting, as a superhuman intelligence. But what do you see as the main benefits AI is bringing to Africa? And are there any particularly compelling use cases that you'd like to single out?
Yeah, for me, I would say, as someone who's, researched these topics and was involved in AI development early on in my PhD, it can be hard for me to recommend because unfortunately, a lot of the tools that, are developed and also even adopted and sold to governments and even organizations alike honestly don't work. And I think that's a big issue. But when I think about the opportunities, I, see AI as a human enabler and also not a replacement of human labor, which in many times, in fields like manufacturing, healthcare, and even in education, developers, and the companies try to push AI as something that can replace human labor, and honestly, it can't. I did work with with not PhD, but community healthcare workers in rural India for my dissertation, and we were interviewing them. We incorporated one of their quotes into the title of one of my papers, and they basically said, "It cannot do all of my work," and they were referring to AI systems. And so, going back to the main question. I think that AI can definitely be an enabler within healthcare, particularly given, and I'll leverage some examples from my work in India to the African context. And, I don't like comparing a single country to a continent, but because of the population size similarities and also, economic similarities, socioeconomic, I think there are some parallels. But again, so going back, healthcare, excuse me. And so when we think about mobile health, a lot of this work is done on the front lines. And so we have these healthcare workers, they honestly don't necessarily have like significant medical training. And so AI tools can help, reinforce their respective knowledge, but also provide them opportunities to get access to specialized information better, to also help their patients. And even this information can be delivered directly to patients themselves. But we also have to be considerate of the respective constraints when it comes to things like actually internet connectivity, patients having access to smartphones or mobile phones in the first place, which is honestly a big hurdle in many African contexts. In education, we've seen a really big skills gap, and particularly like training has basically worsened, and left many kids out of school over the past half decade now. And so I think there are many opportunities to develop these context-specific tools to help students, augment their respective training, with education they're receiving in school. If they're not in school, unfortunately, I still think there are ways that education can be leveraged and also, again, delivered through these mobile platforms, because we know that in African contexts, a significant number of consumers actually access the internet through their phone. And then in agriculture, I would say that's probably the last domain I see a lot of impact for AI, particularly because we see lots of unproductivity, within different African contexts, particularly Nigeria, where logistics issues, are built upon other issues that farmers already face in terms of crop yields and having to deal with these changing weather conditions, which actually disproportionately impact Africa. And so developing these personalized AI systems to help farmers optimize their crop yields, and then, also, work towards connecting them with suppliers or sorry, distributors to help actually ensure that their produce doesn't go to waste, which is a really big problem in Nigeria and other countries as well.
Thanks. So, kind of a common theme I'm hearing across your three kind of agriculture, health, and education use cases, right, is that AI, especially the current AI models we have, are really, really good at pattern recognition. And so, if you have relatively good data, say about like crop yields and weather systems, you have relatively good data about student performance. If you have relatively good data about somebody's symptoms, then often AI can offer very specific, tailored kinds of predictions. But kind of as you said, that also implies having access to internet and data in the first place, which is I think we're gonna talk a little more about with Dr. Adams. So you recently wrote a piece for Brookings that one of the ways you think African governments um, that you think African governments can design and adopt their own governance approaches when addressing the current and future roles in AI, and that this was sort of critical, you felt, in order for them to be able to leverage the benefits from AI. So what are some of the main elements of this kind of governance approach, and what advice would you give to the African government and security sector actors that have joined us today if they're seeking to try to find ways to harness the benefits of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so something, I always advocate for, these local homegrown solutions, more so in like AI development, but also in AI governance, because, within the African context, it's been really interesting seeing, the number of strategies, within the data and also AI sector grow over the past like half decade or so, even though there were a lot of data governance policies already in place, before, ChatGPT, tools like ChatGPT came out. And so I think this can be done by actually leveraging this local expertise and not relying, so much on foreign entities or funders, to help drive these respective agendas, because I think that, this can have an undue influence in terms of basically like who these respective policies and frameworks benefit. And so, even though again, like many African governments don't necessarily have like the technical capacity in-house, there are researchers they can rely on in their local universities. There are civil society actors who have been critically studying these socio-technical impacts of AI and digital technologies as well, that they can also rely on. And, in the case that, if this may not be the case, I feel like the AU also has, the capacity to fill in some of these gaps, with their, with APET, for example, their high-level panel on emerging technologies. And so this is something I advocate for a lot. And then also, I think another approach in terms of just understanding how governments themselves can harness the benefits of AI is really, again, just being critical about these respective technologies and also really doing these assessments to understand like where best AI can be integrated in. Because again, we have these issues with AI systems, especially those tailored for government services. For example, there have been a couple cases in Australia, the Netherlands, and other places around the world where AI systems have actually inappropriately flagged benefits of social benefits, as fraudsters, and basically like impacted lives in negative ways, and asking people to pay back tens of thousands of dollars, when they were unfortunately unable to, and this drove them down even to more socioeconomic despair. And so this is again, and because of this, like I think there was one case where like the parliament or something resigned in one European country because of these issues. And so I think that we have to again be critical of these technologies, and then also because a lot of the things that governments are trying to have AI do, or even companies, can actually be solved through like very simple algorithms. And so that's why I think it's really important to do these assessments to understand where the critical needs for AI, and then also like actually what is the approach to solving this. And again, because many African governments don't have this technical capacity in-house, I think that again it's really important to rely on technical experts, especially those that come from the respective domain, that will be impacted. And so these are some of the things I would recommend for governments.
Thanks. So number one, make sure you even need AI to resolve whatever problem that you are trying to solve. I mean, I think that's great advice. I think people don't realize quite how computationally intensive AI is and how much expertise AI systems often take to run. And especially if you live in an environment where there isn't a lot of internet connectivity or access, there might be easier solutions available. And also the importance for having very, rather than necessarily, there's a lot of expertise on AI in Europe, in China, but it's not necessarily going to be suited for your local context. So you need to draw on your local researchers, who I think do have, one of the things I tell people a lot when we do these webinars is that Africans and African governments, African institutions often have a lot more expertise than they get credited for. They're often not just looking in the right place. So very, very, very good advice there. Let's bring you into the conversation, Dr. Adams, to kind of maybe deepen some of the points that Dr. Okolo made about some of the data requirements, some of the potential inequalities and harms of AI. You have this great new book out called New Empire of AI and the Future of Global Inequality. And in it, you argue that the biggest threat to the transformative potential of AI isn't so much superintelligence, at least for now, that has concerned a lot of prominent thinkers and analysts, but really inequality. And I'd like you to unpack for us what you mean by that. How do you see inequality relating to kind of the main challenges stemming from the diffusion of AI, both now and in the future?
It's such a pleasure to be here, and this has been such an interesting conversation to listen to so far. So, Nate, just to kind of explain that quip about the biggest challenge I think we see with regards to the transformative potential of AI, the potential that AI claims to have and that the industry claims it has is a really radical potential to make the world a better place for everyone, to improve health outcomes, to improve educational outcomes, to boost economic growth. Really big claims. But these things won't just happen. They won't just happen in a way that is equitable. And we've seen with the kind of rollout and adoption of these technologies around the world that their benefits and harms are distributed. So it tends to be that already privileged populations and groups whose worldviews are well represented in the data these models are trained on, who already have access to and know-how of a whole suite of digital technologies, are able to benefit in their workplaces, in their homes, or in the industries or countries they work from these very advanced technologies that bring about all sorts of efficiency and productivity gains. But for people in contexts who are already marginalized from global society, whether socially, economically, racially, or for gendered reasons, and whose perspectives and opinions and life patterns are not well represented in the online data that many of these models are trained on, these systems have a greater chance of negatively impacting these people. So I think we need to be very, very careful about how we're using these technologies. I completely agree with Chinasa's perspective that we need to approach them critically, and we need to think in very realistic terms about what kind of benefits they are going to bring, for whom, and at what cost. So much of what I'm trying to do in the book, because I'm based here in South Africa, I've lived here for 17 years now, is to say that the African continent is already playing an outsized, incredibly crucial role in the global industry that is artificial intelligence. But African people are not reaping the benefits of this. African countries aren't reaping the benefits of this. So just to kind of take you through a little bit of that supply chain, it starts off with the extraction of rare earth minerals, much of which we know is from the Great Lakes region in Central Africa. But the extraction of the minerals is not where wealth creation really takes place. It takes place in the refining of these industries, which happens in other parts of the world. And we also know that, the regions, the Great Lakes regions are rife with conflict and human rights abuse, partly because there's so much foreign interest in the wealth of minerals in these places. Then, taking this further out along the supply chain, you have the critical role that data labelers, often across the African continent, we've had some really important whistleblowing from Kenya to find out just how harmful the kind of practice is of these kind of data farms, where a big tech company will contract out another company who'll contract out another company to set up a kind of computer center in somewhere kind of temporary, where contract workers are brought on board in insecure kind of positions at really low wages to do the kind of dirty work of AI, to make AI clean for the privileged people who don't have to see harmful content on their social media feeds, or who gets an AI system that's well able to recognize a motorbike or a ladder or whatever it might be. AI systems don't just miraculously appear capable of reading and understanding the world. There are people that refine and correct and monitor to ensure that it's behaving properly. And this work, much of this work, is taking place across the global south, where it's cheap, but it's not work opportunities that are lifting people out of poverty and creating new industries that enable economic growth. It's this kind of fly-by-night, come in, come out, short-term contracts, low wage, low pay, and often leaving people with deep social, psychological harms from processing the kind of content they do. And then you kind of have the end of cycle, where you have all the hardware, the tablets and the phones and the smart fridges, and when these stop working, those physical assets and things have to go somewhere, and often get dumped across the global south and across the African continent, and then cause huge kind of health issues and problems in those places where they're dumped. So if we can start by thinking in a bigger way about the role that the African continent is already playing, the very crucial role, and how that can bring benefit to the African people, I think that's a start.
That's a really interesting kind of overview of the role that the African continent plays kind of in the overall global kind of technology supply chain, and how some of the ways and how some of that role actually kind of reinforces existing global inequalities, as you write about in your book. I'd like to bring in and get your perspective more on how you see the potential for AI to impact the security sector. We're already beginning to see the use of artificial intelligence to inform strategic and military decision making. We've seen for a while now the use of AI in surveillance intelligence systems. We're beginning to see it in targeting systems. And I would expect these use cases to grow as AI becomes cheaper and more widespread. So how do you see the security challenges stemming from the diffusion of artificial intelligence impacting the African continent?
This is a profoundly important question, and one that within the African context is very, very interesting. Africa has a very complex security environment, and throwing in a technology that is a technology of power, of great power that can potentially do really good things, helping to create early warning systems to monitor the outbreak of conflict, or to support peace building initiatives by more deeply tapping into public sentiment and ensuring that decision makers and peace builders have access to that information. But unfettered power can be hugely problematic and dangerous, especially in a very complex security environment. So what we want to be seeing is the use of these technologies in a way that's adequately safeguarded and where there is independent oversight for their use. So that means there are institutions of democracy, local ones in different countries where they might be promulgated, that can oversee and monitor the use of these technologies to ensure that they aren't harmful. But I think it's incredibly complex. I mean, some of the uses that we're seeing of artificial intelligence is in a humanitarian context. And yes, that can be helping to more efficiently distribute aid relief, but it can also be to surveil refugee populations and migrant populations who we know are already vulnerable in terms of not having the same claim to their human rights when they are without citizenship in any particular country, where many of the legal systems don't provide adequate safeguards for these people, because under national security, you can waive the kind of privacy requirements or other kinds of requirements. So I think that's a sector where we need to be really careful about understanding what's going on.
I think that last comment made really clear that AI it's a tool, right? It has potential benefits and potential risks. And especially when it comes to security, it's fundamentally a dual-use technology, right? So the same technology you might be using for ISR purposes is also going to help you potentially efficiently allocate human aid. And I think both you and Dr. Okolo have alluded to the need for oversight for kind of African approaches to AI. So I'd kind of like you to kind of, as a final question, and I encourage folks to begin to ask additional questions because we're about to get to Q&A. But a final question for you is kind of, you've laid out a series, I think, of pretty challenging risks, from kind of AI's potential to kind of feed into kind of existing global inequalities and global technology supply chains, to its potential misuse. So what can African governments do to mitigate some of the challenges and risks that you've identified?
Thank you. I think that's a really important question. I think one of the key things that we want to see is how can African governments use their power to hold to account foreign tech companies that are having a harmful impact in their countries. So I think one of the things we often think about, and it is a really important area, is around misinformation and disinformation. And I think this is a particularly important one for political leaders across the African continent, because if we have a public trust fallout with the use of this technology, then that's going to undermine any positive use cases we might see across health or agriculture or wherever, because people lack the trust in this technology. So thinking about Meta no longer providing fact-checking, what that means, how we can put pressure on particularly social media companies to ensure that they are adequately monitoring content that could be inflammatory, harmful, particularly kind of deep fakes, is one important thing that we need to see. We conducted a study called the Global Index on Responsible AI, which is the largest study to have surveyed 138 countries around the world on commitments and practices to responsible AI, and included 41 countries from Africa. And we found that only 2 countries have government frameworks in place that address safety and security of AI systems. So this is Kenya and Rwanda, although I think there are a number of other countries that are thinking about these issues and putting in place frameworks. There are, I think, Chinasa referred to this earlier, there are important activities going in the non-state sector. So in academia and in civil society organizations, we certainly found that academic groups in Algeria, Benin, Libya, Morocco, South Africa, and Tunisia were particularly active in this kind of area. So thinking about how African governments can work with that local expertise to develop local solutions to these issues. I think in the security space, there's also an important one about how do we democratize the management and anticipation of conflicts. So open source technologies that allow local groups to have access to early warning systems and be able to take action locally is something that I think is going to be really, really worth exploring. I think we know that local actors are particularly important in conflict management and peace building. So how we think about designing and enabling technologies that suit and benefit them, I think is really, really important. And I think on top of that, we want to see the evaluation and monitoring of these systems in practice. So when they're rolled out in communities, in countries, we want to find more holistic ways of measuring and monitoring the impact of these systems, which means involving affected communities in that processes. So I think African governments play a really important role in kind of connecting these dots between society and the public and the experts that are already working in these spaces. I find that engaging with many African governments, they have a very clear sense of where AI could help them solve particular challenges they've identified, whether in security or education and building curriculum in mother tongue languages or allocating children to schools. But very often, the local AI developers and communities are not that well connected to the policymakers. And so there's a little bit of a disjuncture there. So I think we need to be thinking about how do we join the dots.
Thank you very, very much. Great. So it's time for Q&A. We already have a couple of really great questions in the chat. So we had, I think, one panelist want a little bit of clarification on the 3 types of AI. I think those were predictive, agentic, and generative. And I guess I'll put this to both of you. How do you see AI continuing to evolve and advance in the future, especially these kind of specific types of categories in AI you identified in the future? Secondly, we had a couple of questions about governance frameworks. So I'm curious as to what you see of any existing kind of good practices and model laws, both in Africa or otherwise. I know that both of you have been involved in, for example, in helping to draft the African Union Continental AI Strategy, which we'll talk more about as the webinar series go on. So maybe you could talk about that. And then finally, for maybe this one is specifically for Chinasa. You mentioned in your remarks that you don't think that AI is going to generate or cause a lot of unemployment. So I'd like you to expand a little bit on that point of view, because I think that is a little bit controversial, although personally I think I agree, but I'd love to hear your take on that. Why don't we start there? I see we have a couple of other questions, but I'll ask those after we've had one round. I think we should have a good amount of time for at least 3 or 4 rounds of questions. So Dr. Okolo, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so I'll start off with the last question first. And so when it comes to unemployment, I think it's especially within AI, and particularly we haven't seen a lot of impacts, let's say, in these global majority contexts. A lot of the negative impacts in terms of the labor force have been relegated to Western wealthier countries, particularly in the US, where the software engineering industry has been suffering. But the thing is, my prediction is that the software engineering industry is actually going to be on a rebound, because there's actually been a lot of reports showing basically how AI, this increasing reliance on AI generated code has actually introduced a lot of securities, in cyber insecurity, security issues and vulnerabilities within code bases for companies, and also just individuals who are relying on these tools alike. And so I think that a lot of companies that laid off people are actually going to start hiring them back because of these respective issues. And also because, again, I think the idea that these companies had in terms of trying to use AI to replace people, honestly, would not work well for them in the long run. And then also we did see a lot of layoffs in the more so creative industries, particularly marketing, script writing, et cetera, et cetera. And because, I would say some of the best use cases for AI at the moment are primarily relegated to those respective fields. And so, within Africa, obviously, there are there is an emerging, let's say, like creative economy. In some countries it's more developed than others, particularly obviously in Hollywood, for example, also South Africa, in Eastern Africa, Kenya, for example. But the thing is, I think that I'm not necessarily also sure of the way that AI has been adopted in these respective sectors to even provide enough context on what the layoffs would look like. But just based on my experience, in the US context, I expect to see similar trends follow for the AI being used to augment more so of these creative tasks, versus these like deep like these more scientific or research based or engineering tasks. And even like when we think about obviously knowing that like agriculture plays a big role in Africa's respective economies, like throughout as a continent as a whole. AI cannot pick crops, and so AI cannot take care of children. AI cannot clean streets, or repair streets or build streets, or infrastructure. And so I think the impact honestly is going to be again relegated to some of these more like blue collar or sorry, white collar industries.
Thanks. Do you want to take a stab at any other questions on kind of good examples in AI governance, or should we
Yeah,
have
I
that?
mean, the thing is, I think that, I guess the AUAI strategies, I think for me, I would say they do provide, framework, let's say starting frameworks. But the issue is that, it's hard to enforce, these soft law frameworks and strategies, which have, continued to emerge within the continent over the past year. And so, I would like to have a much better answer, but the thing is like we have to first focus on like this data governance reformation to actually really make an impact within the AI ecosystem, in my opinion, because we've seen data basically be seen like kind of like, as I don't like to say it is the new oil, but in a way it is. And we've seen companies, for example, dedicate or like reshift their respective like priorities to focus on this data extraction of their consumers, to actually start building and refining their respective generative AI models and systems. For example, companies like LinkedIn, X or Twitter, and other platforms, Meta, have changed their privacy policies to actually allow for this data extraction to occur. And we know that in African context, there, especially when we think about the governance of this data and the emerging governance of AI, there is a lack of enforcement in on these respective like policies as well. So I'm really thinking about this data governance aspect first versus AI, because we don't have any binding frameworks. And even continental efforts like the Malabo Convention, which is basically the Data Protection and Cybersecurity Convention from the AU, it's not binding as well. And so I think it leaves a lot of gaps, aside from the actual like national state or national data governance policies that have already been enacted. But yeah, I'm still kind of iffy on good frameworks to recommend.
Thanks. So, but I think you made a crucial point that's worth highlighting for our audience who may not be experienced with sort of some of the technical aspects of AI, which is that in order to AI to function well and specifically for it to be used in a context specific way, it requires data, lots and lots of data. So that's why Dr. Okolo was recommending that rather than skipping directly to AI regulation, it's important to start with basic kind of data protection, organization, even collecting good data. I mean, that's part. I think people don't realize quite how, especially with the generative Maya models, how resource intensive it could potentially be to use. So that's a really, really excellent point. Dr. Adams, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe I can answer the question about where I see the technology evolving with how do we want to see it evolving? Good technology diffusion, and for us to see the economic and social benefits of this technology, it needs to be widely diffused across societies. But for that diffusion to happen, technology needs to be useful and easy to use. So I think what we want to see is these AI technologies being better designed for use in different kinds of African contexts. So we're moving away from, as Chinasa says, at the moment, it's kind of useful for blue collar workers who are already dependent on emails and PowerPoint presentations, and AI can kind of do these things for them. We want to see AI technologies that are able to function in local African languages, that may not be dependent on kind of smartphone technologies, but have a more kind of low-tech usage and value as well. We want to see speech-to-speech kind of technologies being enabled, so it's not just kind of written in, but people can speak their own language into a standard phone and receive kind of advice or input back in their language in speech. So I think these are the kinds of developments that we want to see in order for it to be useful in a more everyday way in more diverse contexts across the continent. And I agree. I think there's a lot of value in the creative industries across Africa too. If I think about, many of the younger generations across the continent and how they're using smart technologies, how they're engaging on social media platforms, many of them are involved in some kind of content creation. And I think this is where AI may be able to kind of help in producing content at scale, if there's enough kind of content that contains kind of local values and culture and examples, and it's not just a kind of Western or European worldview that's being promulgated through them. But this comes from using these technologies more and more. So I think there's some interesting things that might happen in the creative industries. And then in terms of kind of good governance frameworks, yeah, I mean, Chinasa is right. We've got a lot of gaps because nothing is meaningfully binding at the moment. And without binding regulation, we really can't hold anybody to account. We can't enforce particular kind of standards. I think in the African context, there's still work to be done to define the ethical values that are important in an African context as we seek to roll out, implement, develop, and monitor these kinds of technologies. So the African Union has developed a strategy, but that is a kind of large framework. It stands as a kind of blueprint for African nations to develop their own strategies with more African relevant kind of potential provisions that could be used. But a strategy is just the kind of beginning of a framework. What I always like to emphasize, because I think they play a really important role, is our institutions of democracy, our information regulators, our electoral offices, our court systems and our judges, our human rights commissions and gender equality commissions, our in South Africa, we have the public protector that monitors how governments are adhering to the constitutional law. And I think these institutions play a really, really important role in ensuring good governance in any kind of industry, ensuring people are protected from harm, and playing that kind of middle role between governments and civil society and populations, but also often between national law and standard and international frameworks. Many of the issues that we face in terms of artificial intelligence are global issues. These technologies are not neatly defined by the formal boundaries of countries and jurisdictions in the same way that national laws tend to not have extraterritorial application, but are just apply to the particular country from which they originate, which means that global governance of AI becomes really, really important for preventing harms at a local level. But we need these global governance discussions and debates to adequately reflect African needs and priorities, experiences, and expertise. And I think we're not there adequately enough, partly because within these spaces there's also an inordinate amount of influence from different parties. So it's a complex one, and I think we're just kind of beginning on the road towards good governance. And I think a really powerful mechanism that we've seen is just the ability for kind of peer learning and peer exchange between political leaders and policymakers across the African continent, but also across other southern regions in the world. I think south to south cooperation and coordination could be really powerful. And I think that's the other role that the regional bodies like the African Union also play an important role in kind of enabling harmonization and interoperability of the frameworks that we put in place so that African countries can more freely, but still responsibly and ethically share data or share talent and people be able to more freely move across borders where they have kind of deep expertise in different aspects of artificial intelligence.
Thank you very, very much. Really comprehensive answers. And we have a lot more questions coming in. So I unfortunately don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them. So I'm going to try my best to group some of your questions into some general questions I can ask the panelists. We had one really, really interesting question come in. How do both of you see China's influence affecting the development of AI? And are there examples of African states either kind of leveraging Chinese AI systems or kind of resisting or kind of pushing back against China's efforts to use AI in Africa? Second, you've talked a little bit about what some of the tools that the AU has through the continental AI strategy, through data protection, data sharing laws. What roles do you see the AU and the UN as in supporting African countries to manage AI? One I think area where I suspect there could be a lot of interest, but also potential challenges is in the area of capacity building. Right, this has been a major point of contention and conversation on global negotiations around developing cyber norms. I think it's already starting to kind of infuse itself into global discussions around AI. So I guess the question I can ask to both of you is, what ought kind of AI capacity building look like, given the need to have contextually appropriate artificial intelligence models, resources, expertise? And then sort of, I'd like you both to expand a little bit on how kind of a lot of data poor and internet poor countries in Africa can effectively leverage AI, if at all. I mean, as Dr. Okolo was saying, we had a question about using artificial intelligence to kind of help decrease illiteracy and overcome barriers to internet access. So how do you design AI to do that? How do you think about how to use AI early warning systems to as this is a question from Joseph Labunga of the Democratic Republic of Congo, but how do you use artificial intelligence early warning systems to detect things like violence or outbreaks of gender-based violence when you're concerned about spending a lot of money in developing kind of the resources and systems you need to kind of develop an AI system to potentially offer predictive analytics? Or should they just invest in human intelligence networks that might be able to help tell them some of the same types of things? So Dr. Adams, why don't we start with you, then go to Dr. Okolo?
Yeah, sure. That's a wealth of really interesting questions. So I'm going to just pick up on some of the themes that I've taken note of. At the end there was quite an important question about early warning systems, how they tend to work, or how AI tends to be used in this context, is to monitor kind of sentiment analysis on social media platforms and to be able to kind of pick up where there are kind of inflaming trends on a particular kind of issue that might aggravate or kind of cause conflict in a particular area. I think these tend to be quite an important mechanism. I think they need to be used really, really wisely and carefully with adequate safeguards. We need to be kind of careful of the biases that can occur and the kind of privacy violations that can occur, and thinking about very often it's a matter of, well, who has access to that? Because some of the problems can be that it's a foreign government who is able to put in place an early warning system and knows in advance of the local government, the national government, when a conflict might occur. So one of the kind of big markers, of course, is just food insecurity. If food insecurity rises, we're more likely to have conflict. So I think we need to kind of think very much about the asymmetries in knowledge and who has access to that information. One of the important trends that I didn't kind of note adequately in the previous Q&A segment is that what we want to see is these technologies becoming cheaper to develop and design, which I think they are. So I think it's, again, kind of pulling together local political leaders and policymakers with local developers so that they can co-design solutions to particular issues like these. In terms of capacity building, at the think tank that I lead in South Africa, we've been running 2 courses, one on African AI ethics and policy and one on African AI and human rights, and 2 certificate courses with the University of Pretoria and University of Cape Town. And we bring together a global faculty of African scholars to teach these courses and to teach them with African content. We find that very often many of these kinds of courses are kind of taught with a global mindset and worldview that doesn't adequately speak to the very different kind of diverse set of contexts and conditions we have here on the continent. But we did find that it was really oversubscribed and a lot of interest in having this African-led and African content courses on these issues. And I do think kind of building capacity around the kind of ethics and governance piece is not just a kind of teaching people about what's going on, but providing opportunities to the many people that are doing incredible work in this area and enabling them to work with and support local policymakers. I think that the China question is a really unfair dichotomy. It's kind of like, oh, either we have American technology that imbibes democratic values, or we have Chinese technology that's more autocratic. And I think that dichotomy is radically simplified and problematic. We do see Chinese technologies often being offered as cheaper alternatives in the African context. So I think we need to dig a bit deeper into why particular technologies are being appropriated and why we have foreign tech transfer from different regions, and focus far more on how do we develop the local technological capabilities so that we can procure local systems and ultimately get to a stage where we are exporting African AI technologies and solutions.
Thank you. Very, very comprehensive. Dr. Okolo, over to you.
Yeah, I think, Dr. Adams, she provided a great answer. So I think just to maybe have potential for other answers or other questions to be answered, I'd be happy to take those.
Okay, sure. Let's go ahead and do that. So there are a couple of different questions. Again, I'm going to try to group them that were coming in. So we have a question from Captain Frank of Madagascar, who was interested to kind of, I think this is directed to you, Dr. Okolo, anyway, get your thoughts on to what extent artificial intelligence can or is replacing human thinking. So I think, you said before you think it more augments rather than replaces human intelligence. So if you, I think, could expand a little bit on where you think maybe some of the limits are of current, I guess, agentic or generative AI AI is, what its challenges are in becoming fully, the super intelligence that I think a lot of analysts are really, really worried about. A second kind of related question, we've had a couple of people kind of write in about concerns about AI becoming increasingly autonomous, especially when it comes to their use in the security sector or for weapon systems. I know you probably were both tracking. There was a big kind of debate over whether or not the world's first autonomous weapon was used in Libya. So I guess to pose that as a question, and this was a question that was asked, how do you see agentic AI being used as a tool by the security sector? And maybe what are some of the harms, benefits, challenges, risks, or use cases for that, especially as you said, agentic AI becomes kind of more widespread and adopted. And then kind of the final question I'd like to pose to you guys, to you is how can African countries effectively kind of continue to integrate AI solutions and systems into existing kind of public service mechanisms? Like if you already have, a census data or something like that, or you're establishing a digital ID system, what are some of the more concrete uses of AI that can help kind of augment or inform African governments as they make decisions based on the data that they do collect, which in some cases is actually quite significant?
Yes. Yeah, very diverse questions. I'll just address the first one and try to get to the others. But I think the issue is that, people are relying actually, too heavily on AI. And I think that also because we have this AI hype, I noticed some comments in the chat and, trying to like, use AI for education and even like to actually develop literacy is something that hasn't been shown as effective or even proved to be empirically like right or even just I would say possible. And so I think that we should try to like not rely on AI too heavily in this context, but also because when we think about, this critical thinking itself, Microsoft actually just literally released a paper last week, that showed that using generative AI, has a negative impact on your critical thinking skills. There have been other papers showing, that students relying, on these like AI tutors for math, for example, actually results in reduced math skills and also critical thinking about math. And so that's why I'm very wary, of, trying to use AI like as a teacher because like this human aspect is necessary. And also when we consider the African context, none of these technologies, particularly from these big companies, are even sufficient enough to operate in, these African local indigenous languages, first off. And so we do, have tools from organizations and companies like Lesan AI, in Ethiopia that is developing AI tools for Ethiopian languages like Tigrinya, Amharic, Oromo, for example. Also Ghana NLP developing natural language processing solutions for Ghanaian languages like Tree, Asante, etc. And then also Lelapa AI in South Africa, developing these multilingual language models, for South African languages, but also for others across the continent. And they're actually focused on small language models, which I actually think will be more effective in the African context because, of many of the challenges that we all described in terms of infrastructure and access to cloud computing. And so I think that's something I wanted to put out there first. And then I'm just going to try to like go through the questions because there were a lot of things asked. But I'm trying to see. Yeah, there's another interesting question, about the approach to introduce and develop an AI in Africa. And also someone else mentioned open source. And again, when we think about these like language specific domains, I'm actually not a fan of using open source technologies for open source. And also because there is a little bit of, I would say, confusion about what open source is, particularly because, lots of big tech companies like Meta, for example, have been misleading the public in terms of what open source means. And so open source means that we have access to the data that is used to train AI models. We have access to the code that represents the architectures that encompass these AI systems. And then also we have access, to other evaluations that they have, respectively done for the models themselves. Right now, what we're getting is open weight AI. So we're just getting access to these models that are wrapped up, in these packages that, are easy to download and, you can operate, but you don't know what's the underlying code. You don't know what was used to train these models. models. And because we know, for example, for language, English and, similar languages, within and others like in the Romance family have very different lexical structures than many African languages and other languages within the global majority, like in Southeast Asia and Latin America. And so we're trying to adopt these models that have been trained specifically for these languages. And so to me, I think there are a lot of African developers at the moment and researchers are building upon like these llamas models and et cetera, and probably R1 models now. But the thing is, it's not, I think that there could be much more innovation happening if these models can be built from scratch. But unfortunately, because we have these infrastructure issues, it's hard to train these models, at a significant scale. And so this is something I would ideally hope and love to see, African governments support and also African research institutions have the capacity to support as well.
Thanks very, very much. If I just may add to that briefly, I think there are a lot of opportunities for creativity that especially some of the low-cost commercial off-the-shelf type of models provide for innovative, African scholars, researchers, practitioners. I just to highlight one, for example, there was this a company called Robots Mali that used ChatGPT, which had recently offered translation support into Bambara, which is a local language in Mali in West Africa. So one thing to, I think, try to get is to get some of the major models to offer translation support, because it's a challenge, as Dr. Okolo said, if you don't have it. And then they use ChatGPT to write in English a bunch of different kind of books that were based on kind of local stories, local kind of culturally relevant examples. They had ChatGPT kind of translate those into Bambara, and within a year we're able to produce like 200 300 books. So I think those types of use cases and natural language processing in particular is where a lot of the innovation is. Dr. Adams, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I know the Robots Mali case really well, and it was a really important one because it was about how do we move away from the kind of old colonial language dominance that we have in Francophone Africa, where so many children are going to school, being taught in French, but at home, this is not their home language. They may be speaking Bambara or whatever local language, and this impacts on the kind of educational outcomes that these children can reach, particularly with regards to literacy. So the idea, as you described, Nate, was to produce at scale local to produce at scale these textbooks for ages kind of 3 to 18 in the local Bambara language. And they went through quite a kind of lengthy process. And I think this is really important to highlight, is that in so many of these powerful use cases where we see, okay, these technologies may be really, really helpful, we cannot underestimate the amount of work it takes to translate these use cases into something locally relevant. So in the Robots Mali case, they spent a long time. ChatGPT would produce a story and it would reference a cat as a pet rather than as a kind of, or a dog as a pet, which is not something that might be relevant in these different communities in Mali. So there was a long process of refining the content that ChatGPT produced so that it was locally relevant through human interventions of local experts and people with local knowledge. But yeah, I think that was a very powerful example. And in South Africa, we've had policymakers say, it'd be so powerful if we could have generative AI technologies that can help us produce learning materials and pedagogical structures in local South African languages to support mother tongue education. But that hasn't kind of linked up yet. So that's why I'm saying I think there's a lot more opportunities than we are able to capitalize on, but we should also recognize that it takes a lot of local input. We can't just take these technologies wholesale and think they're going to work in our context without significant refining. So I think a lot of what we want to be seeing is a kind of multi-stakeholder processes, like what we call sandboxes, where these technologies are developed locally, but we have researchers monitoring their development and the decisions made in the design of them and the impact of their rollout. And we have regulators involved in making sure the use of these technologies are safeguarded and people understand what's happening and how it may impact them and what kind of rights might be affected. And it builds kind of technical know-how as you go. I think we have to find ways to learn as we go and to bring the different stakeholders together. I think we can no longer think of regulators as coming after the fact, but need to be involved in the rollout of new and exciting use cases that we think might be particularly impactful.
So not to harp on the point on how to the labor point that I think has come up a lot, but I think your comment on robots Molly highlights how I'm not necessarily not confident that AI is gonna destroy a lot of jobs all at once. Anybody who has used ChatGPT or other search tools to try to come up with a writing implement, for example, knows it can come up with something that's okay, but in order to get something like very, very high quality, like a high quality story, a high quality written piece, it takes an awful lot of editing and correction. And in my experience, I think that's what the studies have shown too, that it doesn't necessarily replace people that are highly skilled. So maybe in a best case scenario, we'll see AI being used as a tool to help upskill people. Anyway, back to the question. Back to I think we have time for one or two more rounds of questions, and we have a lot in the chat. One question is, I'd like to both of you. We already began this conversation with the robot Smalley example, but what are the contributions that Africans are making to the whole AI agenda, both globally and within African countries? We talk a lot about at least the technology and the resources being dominated by the global South, by the global North, excuse me. But I don't. From where I've been engaging a little bit in this space myself, not nearly as much as the two of you, I see a lot of at least interest by a lot of African governments, certainly the African Union, in becoming quite engaged in terms of trying to shape overall global debates on AI governance. I think that the African Union's continental continental AI strategy is one example of that. I think certainly more engaged than African countries were at the beginning of kind of global debates on kind of cyber norms. So I'd be curious, both of you, if you would maybe highlight. Let's have both of you highlight what do you see some of the main contributions African scientists and technologists, African diplomats, African heads of state, African leaders, and African people can make and are making to global debates about how to manage, govern, and use AI. Dr. Okolo, let's start with you.
Yeah, when it comes to, I also want to, add in a bit about like AI R&D because, I'm a scientist. I think all of us here are, scientists or researchers, let's say. And so for me, I think when I, try to quantify the contributions, of African researchers and developers like on the global stage, the numbers, are honestly like very paltry. Basically, 2% of all like scientific research output, comes from the African continent. If we consider AI, I'm sure this number would probably drop to like 0.5% or not, maybe not even make up 1%, unfortunately. And also, we know that 0.2% of all data sets that contribute to AI development actually come from both like South America and Africa. And so obviously like these are big issues. And I'm not necessarily sure like how this will change without, these actual like structural reforms, particularly, by African governments, to actually invest in strengthening like these educational pipelines, particularly the tertiary pipelines in terms of having African students be able to actually stay on the continent to pursue these advanced degrees in computer science, AI, machine learning, et cetera. Because, lots of students have to leave the continent if they don't go to countries like South Africa, for example, which in my opinion has the best AI institutions on the continent and like the AI like academic research environments on the continent. And so once they leave, they're actually like very likely to stay in their respective countries that they go to for this tertiary education, Canada, the UK, US, etc. We already see this brain drain happening like very significantly with Indian communities, for example. And so I'm sure this is happening or will happen slowly happen at a greater scale for African researchers, AI researchers specifically. And so, but I do, obviously want to acknowledge, I always, try to make room for mentioning these grassroots AI communities. And I actually think that this is something that, the African continent and African researchers have actually set basically like a good precedent for, basically have become well known for on this global stage. And, Masakane has, basically worldwide acclaim, or other organizations like Daba, which a lot of the founders of Masakane are also involved in that effort as well. Other organizations, like I mentioned, Ghana NLP, AI Saturdays Lagos, Tunisian AI Society, et cetera, have been really involved in like helping fill in some of these capacity and training gaps that we've seen for this AI education and also research opportunities to help bring in people that, may not necessarily like be able to get into these PhD programs, but they can actually conduct this AI research and learn, in community. And so this is something I think that has the opportunity to scale, but, will still need this institutional support, from governments as well.
Thanks. So Dr. Okolo gave us a reasonably somewhat bleak picture of the current state of African research contributions to AI. Dr. Adams, do you want to talk a little bit more about what African governments and the AU is doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think Chinasa makes such an important point about the brain drain issue that we face, and the talent that we have on the continent really just being snapped up by big tech companies. And so I think when we see innovators developing technologies, not necessarily for monetary gain, but for social good, social justice kinds of issues in contexts where they don't have stable electricity and they don't have constant access to the internet and they don't have the best compute capabilities. These people are kind of working against all odds to produce really, really innovative solutions in complex contexts. So yes, Masakana, Lalapa AI, these are really, really fantastic examples. There's also data science Nigeria and Amino Health in Ghana. And then I think on the policy side, I think the space globally is still emerging. So I think there's an enormous amount of opportunities for African leaders to be involved in shaping that space, and many already have. I do think that South Africa's presidency of the G20 this year is a really important opportunity. And I know AI is featuring heavily, and that the South African government have made a very deliberate stance to say they don't want to be just speaking to the South African context, but raising and amplifying, platforming African-wide issues and demands about artificial intelligence in this moment of the G20 of 2025.
We have about 10 minutes left, and I want to end with, I think, some of the more concrete questions we've had from a couple audiences about how they think about applying AI in their own context. So we had a question from David Macca from Afropol, and also a question from a colleague in Togo who are interested in Colonel Palabe of Togo, is how can artificial intelligence be used to help African countries fight terrorism or fight non-state armed actors or threats? I mean, I know this is something that maybe one of the answers is you got to think about whether to use it in the first place. But this is, I think, something that, given that I think for a lot of African countries, terrorism or the threats from non-state armed groups are top of mind. This is a very compelling questions for all of them. And then another kind of question we had was how can AI be used to help governments fight corruption or maybe broadly improve their services in general. So why don't we start with you, Dr. Okolo, and we'll go to Dr. Adams.
Yeah, so will be frank that I, don't see, okay, I don't want to say I don't see a lot of promise, but I'm actually not the biggest supporter of using, AI in defense applications, particularly in those that are involved in, targeting civilians and or let's say like terrorists, because these tools are not necessarily the most accurate, and if they are, they're, used indiscriminately, unfortunately. And so when we think about like defense more generally, I think there are opportunities because we see that AI tools in particular can help, learn, the patterns and also just like I would say trends in terms of how, let's say, terrorist groups operate and also how they organize, on different platforms. Those are, are actually able to be accessed aside from, those like WhatsApp and Telegram, which, have these encryption rules that prevent many AI tools from accessing these services. But because we know that, for example, like a lot of this organizing happens on Facebook. And Facebook content moderation policies, fail in a lot of cases, to stop the spread of these respective groups. I think that African governments can leverage tools, that help identify this content across platforms, obviously focusing on training systems in these local languages, and then helping, to slow the spread of so like recruitment into these groups that happen digitally, of course. I think in terms of trying to, stop this in-person issues could be hard because, we see that information and also disinformation tends to move offline, and it's very hard to stop that when it happens. And I've referenced, a lot of ACS's work when it comes to like these disinformation networks. And because, also pointing to ACSS research that there are a lot of foreign actors, particularly Russia and China, mostly Russia, that are having like a lot of undue influence on, I would say like this interference, and I don't want to say necessarily terrorists, but interference in terms of, African elections, let's say. I think there are ways like to help address some of these, to leverage AI to address some of these issues. In terms of the other question, what was that, please?
Improving government services, anti-corruption.
Yes. Yeah. So I actually, believe that one of the best cases, for AI will actually be used, for helping corruption. The issue is that because of this, many governments will not want to adopt this. And so I think that if we are able to, have the public advocate for these respective solutions, along with civil society and other actors to ensure this gets accountability, I think it'll be really helpful because I've been following organizations within Nigeria, particularly such as Traka, in budget, and they actually do a lot of work actually just publicizing like where are these contracts, who are these contracts being awarded to, what is the amounts that are being awarded, and also like why actually, are organizations that have no expertise in this sector being awarded contracts to build, roads or install electricity cables or poles. And so I think that a lot of this work, I know these organizations are, leveraging AI in these processes, but the governments have to do this work as well. And so, civil society, honestly, in many African countries, takes a disproportionate amount, of accountability in terms of like holding these governments accountable. And so I think that, AI can definitely help with this, but the thing is like governments themselves have to be willing to adopt, these respective technologies, for fighting corruption and ensuring accountability.
Thanks. Dr. Adams, anything to add or any concluding remarks?
No, I think that was a brilliant answer, which I fully support. Maybe just to talk a little bit to the kind of use of AI to improve the delivery of government services, because this is something that I think there's a lot of interest in, but is also somewhere that without thinking through the kinds of risks and biases that can occur, and the kinds of safeguards that we need to prevent people from being kind of inadvertently denied access to social grants, which we've seen in South Africa very prominently. And then I think the other kind of concern with these kinds of systems is who has access to this data, because it tends to be highly sensitive personal data about often the most vulnerable groups and populations within a country. And so who has access to that data, what it's used for, is something that should be very, very, very carefully monitored and guarded.
Dr. Okolo, any final words from you?
Yeah, just echoing some of the sentiments I've, been saying throughout the conversation is that I think, again, there are many opportunities, for AI to help address many of these pressing socioeconomic challenges within African countries and also the continent as a whole. However, I think that we have to ensure that these tools are integrated and developed cautiously and also with respect for human rights and autonomy as well. So, yeah, thank you all for being here today.
Thank you very, very much. So I'm going to offer some brief takeaways, and then we'll conclude. One, I think, as we heard from the very beginning from Dr. Okolo, AI has been around for a very, very long time and is continuing to advance. We definitely have experienced a wave of advancement in recent years, which, with a turn away from kind of more predictive AI systems, which are already in widespread use, to more agentic and generative AI models. But we're still a long way, I think, from having AI really generally become super intelligent or replace human intelligence. So one of my key takeaways is I think over the next probably 5 to 10 years, we're going to see the degree to which this agentic AI gets integrated into economic, political, and security systems and what kind of effects it has. I think one of the other kind of major takeaways is that there are a lot of barriers for effective AI use and adoption in Africa. And it's not clear to what extent the benefits from AI are to be had in Africa right now without kind of, I think, significant efforts to regulate and localize and adapt artificial intelligence technology to African kind of solutions, African specific context, African specific approaches and problems. And to me, and I think this is something we're going to get in a lot more in the subsequent sessions when we talk more about how to apply AI in the security sector contexts. That means everybody needs to do their due diligence, right? I think as Dr. Okolo said from the very beginning, one of the first questions you as government and security sector actors should be asking when you're considering using an AI system is, do we even need this system, right? Given the data requirements and expenses involved, is there a simpler way to get the information or get the result or get the outcome that I want? And sometimes you're going to find, I think, really interesting potential use cases. Like I think my bias is I think that I somewhat disagree with Dr. Okolo and Dr. Adams. I think that AI's use for strategic military purposes and intelligence gathering targets inevitable. I think the important point is how you regulate it and make sure that it applies with kind of the laws of armed conflict that have been established. And I think that there are going to be a whole host of questions that you are going to have to ask yourself. How do we take some of these systems, which are going to be being developed mostly by non-African powers, and how do you adapt them to make sure you don't cause excessive civilian casualties, for example, as Dr. Okolo was talking about. I think those questions need to be addressed to ensure the effective AI use across the continent. And I look forward to kind of deepening this debate and deepening your understanding of kind of the implications for AI in Africa in the future, in the webinars to come. So just a brief reminder of the calendar before we conclude. I hope you came away from this conversation with at least a better understanding of AI's general implications, the opportunities and challenges it exists across the continent. Tomorrow, same time, we're going to talk about how AI is affecting Africa's threat landscape. So we're going to talk specifically about how AI is being used by some of the non-state armed actors, terrorist groups, criminal entities that some of you mentioned in your questions. In a few weeks, we're going to move from talking about sort of how it's affecting the threats to talking about how to think about AI strategy, how to think about applying AI. That's going to be March 13th and March 14th. And then April 3rd and 4th, we're going to talk about managing AI risk, and which is significant, as I think, I hope one takeaway you have from this, but also how to kind of advance regional and international cooperation on AI. And I very, very much look forward to you continuing to be part of the conversation, to continue to ask all these amazing and enlightening and complicated and many. I think we had over 40 questions for this webinar, to give you a sense of what the interest is. And so thank you very much. Thanks to both Dr. Okolo and Dr. Adams for their excellent presentations.